Afternoon or hello, good morning. I'm Dr. James Danoff-Burg from the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens. And again, today we are together for our Building Community Conservation Success Social Science Workshop series. This is session 5, a handful of sessions so far. Congratulations on getting to this point. We've been setting you up over the last 4 weeks for the opportunity to begin developing a tool, developing an instrument. We are putting together a survey, a structured survey today, which is very exciting. And we will begin that and spend the whole day today creating questions. We're going to walk through a whole series of different types of questions. And then we'll talk about how one would structure a survey, like how you would sequence the questions and why you would sequence them in that way. So that's what the goal for today is. So without any further ado, let's begin that. We'll switch over to our PowerPoint and make it full screen. And here we go. So today is about crafting a survey. This is the 5th in our series. The last 2 sessions with Alex were really great at getting us up to speed with understanding a lot of basic theories and ideas about why we would use quantitative or qualitative data and what the differences between those two are, why we would do surveys or why we would do a variety of other alternatives to surveys. But today our focus is just on structured surveys. So we are in week 5, crafting the survey is today. So we've talked about the reasons for community-based conservation and why it's so important to use social science. We talked about organizing research over sessions 2 and 3, one from myself, one from Alex. And then last week we talked about the selection of data collection methods and the great diversity of ways that you can collect social science data. Today we're talking about crafting a survey. So we'll talk about the value of these structured surveys. And when I talk about or mention surveys today, almost always I'll be talking about structured surveys, not semi-structured, not focus groups, not discussions, not open-ended explorations. This is going to be a structured survey. And there'll be a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data and questions that we'll gather together. So we'll talk about research design, we'll talk about how to get started on a survey and some survey guidelines and tips, and why mixed methods approaches to surveys are so important. And then we'll end the day encouraging you to take the survey questions that you have put together today and crafting them into a survey themselves. It's a very exciting day today. We're creating an instrument that you can then use to answer your question that we've been refining on the early parts of the sessions today and sessions for this series in sessions 1 and 2. And then we're also going to be focusing in on one of those methods of collecting those data, which again is what? Structured surveys. If you said that, that's what we're doing today. Okay, so a reminder, the goal of conservation psychology is to try to stimulate pro-environmental behavioral change that is locally appropriate and acceptable. And to do that, we focus on attitudes or behaviors, attitudes, and values. And the easiest to change, if you remember this from earlier on in our series, is behaviors. Getting people to change how they act is much easier than trying to change their attitudes towards that thing, towards that species, towards that place, towards that concept. And of course, values at the bottom of the pyramid on the screen are the hardest to change. It's very difficult to change values. It's much better to focus on behavior change and specific behaviors, which Alex talked a lot about in the last 2 sessions. So we'll continue on. As a reminder, knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. And knowledge is sort of a kind of behavior. So that feeds into behaviors, which feeds into attitudes. But people like CAB, K-A-B. So this is how we are going to be able to do our outcomes-based evaluation. This is a slide that you've seen before. And we want to be able to answer those good questions that we've created and whether those questions have led to changes in knowledge, attitudes, or behaviors. Sound good? Okay, so What I'd like you to think about again, just a reminder, what are those knowledges that you would like to change? What would you like your audience to know more of? What are the attitudes that you would like your audience to change? And last, if any, what are the behaviors that you would like them to change? Okay, so again, to rank these from easiest to hardest: knowledge, behaviors, attitudes. Attitudes are hardest, knowledge is easiest. So take a minute and again think about, given the question that you've been developing over the last 4 sessions and have refined over the last 4 sessions, and taking into account all of the research design questions that Alex has been asking you, what are the knowledge changes that you would like to see in your populace? What are the behavior change? And what are the attitude changes that you would like to see? We'll pause for a moment. You pause the video here and write that down. All right, so continuing on. As a reminder again, when we do our surveys, whether they're structured surveys or however we do our data collection, this is a social contract that we're entering into. And we have to remember that the amount of effort that we are asking for people to spend in terms of time and emotional efforts and intellectual efforts, if necessary, these are costs, and we are asking them to pay those costs when we ask our participants to do the survey. So keep that in mind. There are, of course, rewards to us, but also to them for participation. People like to share their opinion. You may be offering an incentive. You may be able to improve their relationship with your organization, which may benefit them in a variety of ways. But remember, there are costs to the people. And as we'll talk about throughout this session today, we want you to try to keep your surveys as short as possible. For the purpose of what we're doing today, just to give away the end, we're going to be asking you to put together about 12 questions altogether. We'll be selecting from the many questions that you'll write. Ideally, if you do this session today in the fullest sense, you'll probably create 30 to 40 questions in total. So it'll give you many to choose from. Okay. So again, a core part of this social contract that we are forming with people is trust. We can build trust in a lot of ways, and one of the ways is by being grateful and by not asking so much of a cost from them, keeping the surveys short. Okay, so continuing on. Remember that the question is the subject from which all else originates. I say this all of the time. Alex has said it several times in the last 2 sessions. We need a clear and well-defined question, because otherwise everything else falls apart. And the entire process of that scientific method that we've discussed is all hinged on the question that you ask. So we need to frame that very carefully. And it, of course, needs to be testable. We need to be able to answer that and or refute it if it's a yes or a no kind of question. Do people support this question, whatever that is? Okay, so question's very important. Spend some time working on refining, if you've not already, the question that you've been working on earlier on in the sessions. Okay, so last session, in the 4th session, Alex talked a lot about the variety of evaluation methods. She touched back on some of the ideas that I had presented in session 2, but went into greater depth with these. There is a great diversity of evaluation methods that are available to you. The one that we are focusing on today is, of course, our structured surveys. That's the top one. But there's lots of other opportunities for data collection. And a thing that we need to emphasize a bit more as well that we'll come back on is that the timing of the effort determines what kind of evaluation it is, right? So in the column that starts with structured surveys, these are all methods. But we can use those methods to answer questions that are presented relative to when the project or the intervention or the effort has begun. Right? Remember, a front-end evaluation is when we do it before the before the implementation begins, before we begin supplemental feeding of some animals or a micro enterprise program, or putting in permanent crawls around animals to protect them from predators, right? We want to do the front end information or surveys, evaluations to gather that data, to understand and better inform our interventions with the communities. Formative interventions, and the second type of evaluation method by effort, are evaluations that are done while you are doing the intervention. So you have an education program and you want to see whether it's meeting your project. The education program is supposed to go for a year, but say 6 months in, you want to be able to see whether it's making a difference already and whether you could improve it. If you did a 6-month evaluation in the middle, basically, of the long-term intervention, that would be a formative because the project is taking form. Makes sense. Last, summative are evaluations that we do after a project has completed. So we've received a 5-year grant because we are very, very fortunate. And we have been doing this research project or this behavior change implementation for 5 years. And we want to know what were the impacts of the entire program after 5 years. That would be a summative evaluation. Make sense? So we have the methods on the one side, and we have the timing of those evaluations on the right. So we could do structured surveys as front-end evaluations, or as formative evaluations, or as summative, depending upon when we do it relative to when the intervention has begun. Make sense? Okay, so we'll continue on. So structured surveys are the focus of what we're doing today. It's a great way to be able to learn about the attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs of a lot of people very quickly. Because if you just have 12 questions, for example, and some of those are on a 1 to 5 scale, a very quick and easy thing to do, ask the question, would you support this, yes or no, a dichotomous question. Or on a Likert scale with a 1 to 5, or a quick answer. What's the one word that comes to mind when you think about giraffe, for example? These are very quick questions, and we can ask if we have, say, 12 questions as we're talking about creating today for the survey that we'll create at the end of the day today. We can ask those 12 questions very quick, maybe in 3 to 5 or 6 minutes. So if it only takes, say, 3 to 5 minutes to do a survey, we can do maybe as many as 10 to 12 surveys an hour. That is lightning fast for social science research to be able to do that if we're doing it by speaking with people. Right? So structured surveys can be done very quickly. But as with the question, we need to know what the goal of the survey is. What is the thing that we want to find out? And just as importantly, who is our intended population? Alex talked a lot about this with the research design, I think in session 3. So we need to think about what are the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, KAB, that of these people very quickly that we can ask and assess very quickly for a large number of people. Structured surveys are used by, I would say, probably most social science researchers because they are the most accessible and very productive in terms of data. There's flaws with them as well, as we'll get to as we go through the types of questions and how we structure those questions today. But there are flaws in all methods. So structured surveys have some flaws that can usually be addressed. So we'll start off with this, and this is going to be the focus for our time today, and much of the data that we'll talk about during the quantitative analysis and for the research methods for the next session and qualitative sessions. These are things that we will offer based on the assumption that you have done or are about to do a structured survey. That's the focus of what we're doing here. Because remember, structured surveys have both quantitative and qualitative, things you count and things you ask people to answer you about on an open-ended field, right? Okay, so structured surveys is our goal. There are lots of ways that we can ask a question. There are many different types of questions, and the format of these questions help to make the value and the rigor of what you're doing better. Some questions work just as well on a dichotomous scale as they would on a rating scale. So you could ask, are you happy with your experience today? Whatever that experience was, this educational program. Yes or no? That would be a dichotomous question. But you could ask that same question, how happy are you about your experience today? 1, not at all happy, 3, neutral, and 5, very happy. And 2 and 4 also being options in between. So on a scale of from 1 to 5, that would be a ratings scale. So there are lots of ways that you can ask the same question in different formats. So we're going to talk about a bunch of different question formats today, going through this whole list of possibilities. And as we're going through, what we want to do, we're going to have the running man come up on the top left of the screen, and we want you to pause the video after we go through a description of that type of question, that format for that question. And then we want you to write down a bunch of them. As many questions as you think might be relevant to answering your larger theory or your larger theme, your larger research question, all right? So, easier way to go about this differentiating between what's a question, different kinds, because there's lots of different forms of questions. So we're going to talk about items is what we're going to be writing today. So we'll have dichotomous items, we'll have rating scale items, we'll have Likert scale items, and I'll talk about what each of these are in a moment. And they will help us to answer the larger research question. So generally when I talk about questions, we're going to be talking about the research question. But when I say items, it will be the things that we're writing here, which are often written in the form of a question, but they are not always. Okay? So we're doing some writings of items. Make sense? Okay. So just for ease of descriptions for what we're talking about here, question is the research question. Items are the things that we are writing today to ask of our participants. All right, so let's begin with the first one, the easiest one, a dichotomous question. Dichotomous di means two, and cotomous means branches, so two choices. So here's an easy one. Are you a community member? Are you a member of this community? Are you a community member of whatever community it is that you're interested in researching? Yes or no? Did you eat breakfast today? Yes or no? Have you ever, or do you have a permanent crawl? Yes or no? Have you ever had a negative interaction with wildlife? Yes or no? Or you can make that more specific. Have you ever had a negative interaction with elephants? Yes or no? So what I'd like you to do now with this type of item, or this type of form of your question, is to come up with a series of items that you could ask that could be useful for answering your larger research question. Make sense? So I just made up a bunch of them off the top of my head there very quickly. Think about what your research question is and write out some items, some questions. All right. So here's our running man. We'll pause the video for just a moment. And if you could do the same, we'll be right back with the next form of questions. All right, so continuing on now. That was dichotomous questions. How many did you get? Many people can usually write 5, 6, even 10 dichotomous questions very quickly. There are lots of possibilities that you can answer with a dichotomous question, dichotomous form of questions. Okay, so you probably have many items in there, many 10 items, 5 items, however many you got there. All right, so hang on to those. Right, dichotomous across the top of those. Next one. Oops. And my space bar seems to have stuck, so I will have to back up a little bit. Next up are ratings scales. A rating scale you're probably very familiar with as well, because a rating scale, if you've ever used TripAdvisor or Yelp or any of the or Zoom or any of a diversity of programs that when you download it or read something, how well do you think this addressed the question? Or how much did you like this program? Or how satisfied were you with your dinner, right? Those are rating scales. And rating scales is a format that works really well for assessing in a numerical sense how happy some people are about some experience that they had, or how knowledgeable are they or do they feel that they are about giraffes, or about conservation, or about medicinal plants, those kinds of things. These would be subjective assessments, but nonetheless still interesting. So on the screen we have a bunch of them. On the left side of the screen there are a series of questions that were summarizing the friendliness, the knowledge, and the helpfulness of a series of different staff members, maybe at a large store, where 1 star is not very good and 5 stars is very good. But then you also have the checkbox, the circle with that's empty in the middle next to not applicable, which someone could click on if they didn't interact with the cashier. They could click not applicable under friendliness, not applicable under knowledge, not applicable under helpful, because they didn't actually buy anything that day. But maybe they did go in to talk to the pharmacist. And so they could talk about how friendly the pharmacist was, how knowledgeable the pharmacist was, how helpful they were. Make sense? These rating scales could be done on any number of options. You can do 1 to 10, you can do 1 to 5, like the ones on the left. On the right side, we have an interesting, this is a pain scale. And you could think of this as if you're talking to a community about economic success or economic challenges. How challenged are you economically in your current mode of life? Some people may say, I'm not challenged at all right now. So they might put a 0. Then other people would say, yeah, I'm only a little bit challenged. I wasn't able to buy all of what I was hoping to do this month, so I put a 1 or a 2. But some people might be completely economically challenged, and they might select 10. As you can see on the screen here, this is a monthly pain scale that doctors would use to ask about how bad is the pain that you are feeling right now for whatever the problem is. Right now, or at its worst in the past month, at its smallest, at its least in the past month, or on average in the past month. And so you can see across the top of there, they have a scale from 0 to 10, and it says none, mild, moderate, very bad, and unbearable. So they would put those labels on to try to give people a feel for what 0 means and what 10 means, or what 1 means. So that's a useful thing to do on a scale. And you can do these kinds of rating scales even not using numbers. You could have, or if you're working with a community that does not, that maybe is not as literate as other communities, you could have smiley faces, where a very negative face is one meaning I strongly disagree. A neutral face would be neutral, with a flat mouth. Or a very strong smiley face would be a 10, or the highest level of I most strongly agree, right? So it's possible to do rating scales with explanations, as in the monthly pain scale on the screens, with no explanations, but just stars, because those have become a pretty commonly understood rating scale, especially for younger people. Or you could do it also with smiley faces on the screen. All right, so we'd like to get the running man going again. And what we'd like you to do is write down a minimum of 3 rating scale questions. In this case, you're writing your ratings scale item, that question, would be the cashier and friendliness. That by itself is an item. The knowledge of the cashier is a second item. The helpfulness of the cashier on the left side is a third item. Right? So you can see, you can come up with a great number of rating scale items very quickly. So take a few minutes, pause the video, and write down as many rating scale questions as would be relevant to your main research question. All right? So pause the video. All right. How many questions did you come up with? Did you come up with 30? Not items, not questions. How many items did you come up with? Did you come up with 30 items? Were there dozens of items that sprang to mind immediately? If you're like me, this is an easy one to fill very quick, because you can very quickly come up with how strongly do you agree with a statement. You can come up with how frequently do you go to the store, right? All of these are rating scales, and you can, as long as you explain what the lowest end, the medium end, and the top end mean, everything else is up to you to decide. And it's a great subjective, all of these are subjective, right? How much do you agree with? How bad is the pain? How would you rate our staff? All of these are subjective statements, which means that they are at the interpretation of the participant. Because what is a mild pain for me might be a very hard pain, a very unbearable pain for you. Even though it's the same level of pain, I just might have a very high pain tolerance, or vice versa, right? An unbearable pain for you might be mild, or might be, I'm sorry, a mild pain for you might be unbearable for me, right? But it's a way to get at people's subjective interpretations of the item that you're presenting to them, to try to answer your research question, okay? So rating scales, very helpful. Now we have another one here, Likert scales, that are very similar to rating scales. But with these, we want to have clear categories as to what each of them mean. So rather than a 1 through 5, we're actually putting putting headers on. So for here, we might say, again, with the rating of agreement or disagreement, and then on each line, each of these lines, you might have a statement and ask them whether they strongly disagree, whether they're not sure, they agree, or they strongly agree. They might be things like, I value our natural resources. Strongly disagree, not sure, agree. And then they would check one of these boxes. If they disagree, they don't strongly disagree, but they feel like, it's not very valuable for me. They might put a checkbox right there. And then on the next line down, it might be, I strongly value elephants living nearby. Strongly disagree, strongly agree, wherever it is that they would check, right? So like with the rating scale, each of the rating scale format for items, Likert scale items can be very long. You can include many items in a single question in your survey, right? So in this question 8 here, we have 5 boxes, meaning we have 5 separate items on this one question, right? Which answers the larger research question. So for this Likert scale, we can come up with a great diversity of items very quickly. So what I'd like you to do, same thing as before, think about a bunch of statements that you would like to see how well people agree or disagree. I never go into the forest to collect wildlife. I never go into the forest to collect medicinal plants. I never go into the forest. It could be a separate one, right? Each of these would mean different things, but they're very small little differences that really inform what you're trying to find out. Okay, so take a moment, pause the video, and come up with some Likert scale items. Okay, so similar to rating scale, welcome back. Similar to rating scale, you probably had a bunch here. The challenge with Likert scales as well as rating scale type of items is that we often come up with the same question and phrase it just slightly differently. So we'll get a lot of questions that are repetitive or slight variances on the other, and we want to be careful with that because we don't want to ask the same question lots of times because that will lead to survey fatigue. And if you have the same question in the form of multiple items many times, people will drop off, I can guarantee. So ideally, if you have similar items that you want to ask very similar questions, don't put them right next to each other. Spread them out if you have a series of Likert scale items in your survey. All right? So if you're like me, you probably came up with a bunch of Likert scale items, 10, 15, 20. These are things that come very fast. So the challenge is editing with these and with the rating scale questions. Okay, next. Now this is an interesting kind of question. We will have, we have the challenge when we are trying to assess knowledge and sometimes attitudes as well, that when we come in and if it's a very information heavy kind of intervention that we're doing with the audience, say we're teaching them how to do more sustainable cook stoves, how to put them in, how to build them, how to make them, how to install them. There's a lot of opportunities for messing it up, right? They could make it too small. They could use the wrong kind of metal or not use metal, just use clay. They could have it vent out the house. They could have it vent into the room. They could have it on a long stovepipe that goes up. And each of these have a different impact on what and how well the stove works. But everyone cooks. Well, every household cooks anyway. And so people might all think that they know what they're talking about when they're talking about stoves. They might say, oh, I know all about stoves. I know how to build stoves. I am very well versed in making stoves because I've built these 3 right here through time. But then you have them go, if you were to ask that question at before you did the intervention, the training on how to make a sustainable stove. And then you do the training on how to build that sustainable stove. And it's very complicated, and it's all about the method and the metal and how long the tube is and how big the tube is, you know, where it's placed in the house, whether it vents out the house, all these things. And then you ask that same person, how comfortable are you or how knowledgeable do you feel about stoves now on the post-intervention? You might actually find them giving a lower value on the post relative to the pre-test, right? So pre-test is when we ask something, ask a question, a survey of someone before an intervention, and a post-test is when we ask them after they do the intervention, right? So we're doing a series of these workshops on trying to put in camp stoves, sustainable stoves in houses, not camp stoves. And if it's a very data intensive kind of approach, you might get a decrease in the post in terms of their knowledge or comfort or attitudes or support of using these sustainable stoves relative to what you did in the pre-test, because people might think that they know more about the stoves until after they go through the training and they realize, oh my gosh, I didn't know anything about making these stoves, and I think that there's a lot more that I need to know in order before I can put them in and be successful. So in those kinds of situations where it's very technical, it's very specific, it's challenging for people to learn the material, the knowledge gains are very, very great. If you're a teacher and you're going in and teaching some kids on how to do habitat restoration, for example, they might think, oh yeah, I just go in and I plant a bunch of plants. But really there's a lot more to it. And once they learn the material, they realize, oh my gosh, there's so much more I need to know in order to do this right that they weren't aware of before. So in very technical, heavy questions or trainings, you would want to do a retrospective pre-post. So here you would have 2 of these lines, and one line would say, I apologize for the formatting on the screen. One line would say, relative to how you felt, relative to how you were before you took this training, how strongly do you feel confident in being able to put in a sustainable stove now? Right? So in that one question, you ask them to think about where they are now and where they were and what they knew before, and rank them. And if you were successful as a trainer, you're going to find an increase in the post relative to the pre. So they're going to say, before I was a 2 and now I am a 3. So they've gone up by 1 ratings level. Right? So you could say, how comfortable were you on the first line with creating sustainable stoves before our survey? That would be the first item on this retrospective pre-post. And they would circle a 2 or check the 2 box. And on the second line down, you would say, relative to how you were before, how comfortable are you now with putting in a sustainable stove? And on that second line here, they might check a 3 or a 4 if they feel really confident of it. So it's possible to ask lots of questions in this retrospective pre-post, as opposed to doing what most people do, which is if they have a training program, they ask people about the field or the topic to understand their knowledge or their comfort with it before they do the training, and then they ask about their comfort or knowledge with that subject afterwards in the post. And then ideally you find that gain. But with this retrospective pre-post comparison, when you have very data-heavy subjects or technique-heavy subjects, more complicated, it's best to do it after. So you don't do a pre-survey, you just do what would have been the pre and the post afterwards, because then they have been exposed to the information. They can themselves assess what their pre-training knowledge or comfort was before relative to after. Lower before, higher after. Make sense? I hope so. Because what we want you to do is take a moment and do a retrospective pre-post comparison question. Think about something you would like to know, especially technically heavy things. Things that have a lot of technical details to them or knowledge about them. And come up with a retrospective pre-post comparison. Question 1. And then second activity here is to try to think about other things that maybe aren't as technically heavy, but you don't have time to be able to do the pre-survey before you do the intervention. So try to do the same kind of thing afterwards. So you came into a community and you found out that there's some big opportunity happening in the community. There's a festival, there's a birth, there's a family celebration. And you want to be able to go to that family celebration and give a quick introduction to something that would be valuable to that family, that community, that they would value. And you know that because of your previous experience and because you're so hooked into the community. So you weren't able to do a pre-test, but you could do a retrospective pre-post. So you do the thing at the celebration, whatever it is, and then you ask people relative to before, how comfortable are you? Are you more or less comfortable? Are you much more? Are you less? Are you much less? Are you about the same? Right? Okay, so take a moment. I'm going to take a drink. And if you could think about a retrospective pre-post question or item that you could ask of people before, what you would have done before and after, but you would do both the pre and the post afterwards. So retrospective, looking back, how comfortable are you now relative to how you were before? Pause the video and we'll get started. Okay, so this is often hard for people to be able to do, and that's fine. Don't feel intimidated by this, but you can do this, I promise. Because what you'll you'll have some interventions, you'll have some questions that you want to know, that you feel it in your guts. If I ask it before and if I ask it after, it's going to influence the intervention. It's going to make it less likely to be successful, or what have you. So retrospective pre-post comparisons are very useful tools to keep in mind. And it's a great way also, if you don't have a lot of time or staff or money to be able to do a pre and a post before an educational intervention or a training program, you could do it just at the end so that you don't have to go into the community before you do the training. You could just do all of the surveys afterwards, but you have to think about how you phrase it. Okay. So next one, multiple choice. These are pretty easy. Most of us have asked and have been answering these all of our lives, whether we're in school, whether we're walking out of a grocery store and people want to ask us about their experience, or you're leaving some place. We get asked multiple choice questions a lot. The important thing with multiple choice type items is that they need to be mutually exclusive options. Only one can be true, right? So we cannot simultaneously be, well, legally, we cannot simultaneously be married, widowed, divorced, and separated all at the same time. So what is your current relationship status? If you're married now, even though you may have been widowed and divorced before, married is what you would put. Right? If your current status is single, but you were divorced, you would check divorced. In the United States, you can see we have many possibilities. Separated is pre-divorce, where it's not formally concluded legally. In a domestic partnership or single civil union is when, in some states, we have the ability to enter into this legally recognized domestic partnership or civil union, which often provides health benefits or next of kin benefits in case someone passes away, those kinds of things. So lots of options. But the important thing for multiple choice questions is that only one can be true. So you can ask many things with this. You could ask age. You could ask tribal affiliation. What is your main tribal affiliation would be the best way to put it, because many people come from many. What is your main ethnic identity? Because many people might have multiple ethnic identities. Where were you born? Or that's not a good one for this one, I take that back. But there are a lot of multiple choice questions that we can ask, but only one can be true. And we have to think about whether we answer these, or how we ask these items. So are you a landowner? Or rather, how big of a land is it that you own? And you can have different categories. Half a hectare, up to a hectare, up to 2 hectares, up to 3 hectares, whatever it is. So none would have to be on there. And so you'd have to think about all of the options that would be available and make certain that all possible options are given so that someone could answer this question accurately for them. All right, so multiple choice form of items. Come up with a few items here. You should be able to come up with, say, 4 or 5 anyway, that are multiple choice formats. Pause the video and get to work. Okay, thanks. Hopefully you had a pretty good opportunity to get through several multiple choice items that you've come up with. Read the item choices very closely and make certain that someone couldn't answer yes to multiple of those. Because multiple choice questions have to be exclusive, mutually exclusive. Only one option can be true for that person, for that participant. All right. One neat thing, if you do things online with survey organizations, like say SurveyMonkey, for example, you'll note that these buttons here, these circles that are open in the center, these are always mutually exclusive. These are always multiple choice questions if it's a circle like this. And we can contrast that with check boxes, which are the next item, next type of item. And check boxes are when we could be multiple things. So multiple items, multiple item options can be true for a person. So for example, in the photo that I have on the screen here, this is one I got off of the web. What factors are important to you when buying a software product? There are many things that may be important to you when buying a software product. It could be price, it could be how user-friendly it is, it could be how good is the support. And if those are the three things that would best answer things for you, sorry, my lights just turned off in the room. We have economical energy-saving items. Let me hit the button. There we go. It's good for saving energy, not so good for giving presentations. So with checkboxes, multiple things can be true. So here, if you want to know, say, all of a person's tribal affiliations, you could list off all of the tribes to which they could possibly identify, or with which they could possibly identify. Or with ethnicity, you could have them have multiple ethnicities listed out here and ask people to choose any that they might identify with. Okay? This is a nice way to be able to collect and then rank how important is a single option within this item for everyone as a whole. So you'll know whether price is checked most frequently, or usability is maybe checked second most frequently, or so on, right? So checkboxes are very useful. Quite frequently we use these for lots of things, lots of questions, especially in conservation, because there are a lot of possibilities. What sort of animals do you have as a farmer? Do you have goats, sheep, whatever, what have you? So all of these things could be separate checkboxes, and they could choose those. Okay? So what I'd like you to do is take a moment and come up with a series of checkboxes, and think back to the earlier multiple choice questions. Maybe some of what you wrote as multiple choice questions may be better as checkbox questions. So let's take a few minutes, pause the video, and write down several checkbox questions, maybe 5 again. And then once you have that many or more, come back and we will restart the video. Okay, so checkboxes, how did you do? Did you get up to 5? Did you get more than 5? Did you find this a very easy one to come up with? An important thing here is to make certain that you focus again on the items. Make certain that the items are distinct from each other, so that if a person wants to answer one, it would not be the same as another one. So you wouldn't want to repeat things. Are you a man and a human? Because it wouldn't tell you much with the second one, right? So try to have your items be most useful and most informative from the perspective of your participants. Okay, so that's checkboxes. And again, checkboxes have squares, and you'll see when they're not checked, they look like that very frequently in the online survey things. If they are checked, they usually change color and sometimes have a checkbox, as opposed to the multiple choice, which have an open circle. Okay, so checkboxes, very useful type of items. Next up, rankings. So we have 2 different options on here. Rankings are very useful when you're trying to identify the relative importance or the relative value of a certain item, category of items, right? You could say, what do you have the most as a farmer? for farm animals. Rank the following in terms of those that you have the greatest number of to the smallest number of. And people could put a 5 by the highest one that they have the most, and 1 that they have the least, just as an example. So on the screen here, we have one, this is very much focused on American television audiences, where they ask participants to rank the following shows in order of preference, with 1 being your favorite, the highest one, and 5 being your least favorite. So what is your number 1 favorite? What is your 5th most favorite? And then you would go through each of these 5 television shows and rank them from most to least favorite. And often we can make a forced choice where we ask people, or where we require people to put a ranking value for all 5 of these. So even if they don't know one of the shows, one of the television shows, they still have to put a number on it. Or, depending upon how you do this, if you're doing it one-on-one, you can set these up very easily. If someone says, well, I only know 3 of them, you say, okay, well, rank the 3 that you know as your most favorite to least favorite. And then you would leave the other 2 blank, not putting zeros, just blank. Okay. Similarly, maybe you've created a design, a logo, or a picture, or you're having a photo contest, or you're assessing how influential someone is. You say, rank these pictures of these people from most to least, most favorite, most influential, whatever it is. So you give them a series of pictures and you ask them to put them in order. Remember we talked about the card sorts? Card sorts are kind of a ranking. And so you could take the cards and arrange them across in front of the person, not in any kind of a linear fashion, but just kind of randomly on the table in front of them, and ask them to order them from most important to least important, or most dangerous to least dangerous, or most favorite to least favorite, from say left to right, or something like that. Okay? As long as you're clear with your instructions, rankings can be very important and very helpful. And that card sort tool is very useful with these rankings as well. It's a good tool to have for this kind of an item. All right, so here's our running man. So take a moment, pause the video, and come up with, say, 2 or 3 ranking questions. It could be using words. You could have them to use the card sort, however you feel it would be most useful to you. You could have the physical objects in front of them. Say you're interested in knowing what kind of wood that they use most frequently. So you bring in those specific samples of wood, rank these woods from most used to least used. And you put the sticks in front of them, or wood samples in front of them, and ask them to rank from most to least commonly used. So it doesn't have to be just a text. It can be a series of cards. It can be samples of woods. It could be samples of pelts. It could be whatever you feel, whatever you have available for people to use to come up with a ranking of most to least. Favorite, dangerous, prettiest, whatever it is. Okay, so take a minute, come up with 2 or 3 at least of these rankings questions, rankings type questions for this item. Make sure you pause the video too. Okay, so these are pretty easy, no? I think most people usually have a pretty good handle on rankings. We're asked to do this quite frequently, like with the ratings scale. Remember, ratings versus rankings, very different. Ratings are a subjective evaluation. Rankings also a subjective evaluation, but but you're ranking multiple things. That's the difference between a ratings and a rankings. So rankings seem to work pretty well and are pretty intuitive for most folks. I hope you had the opportunity to come up with a couple, 2 or 3 or more. It's a very useful type of item. All right. So all of what we've been talking about thus far are quantitative methods. right? These are things that can be counted or summarized in numbers in one form or another. All of those kinds of items that we talked about just a second ago: dichotomous keys, ratings, Likert scale, rankings, check boxes, multiple choice. Now, let's go into qualitative measures. These are more of the open-ended ones. And as you can see on the screen, you've seen this several times already. Alex used it last session, and I used it, I think, in one of the earlier sessions as well. What did you feel like when you saw the free ice cream? And why was that? Like a follow-up question. So qualitative questions, or what we call open-ended questions, are really useful tools. And you can ask these open-ended questions in a great diversity of fashion. You can try to constrain them a little bit. Your 3 favorite experiences today were what? Not ranked in any kind of a way. What were your 3 favorite experiences that you had here with us today? What were the 3 best things that you learned during our training workshop today? What were the top 3 facts you learned in our educational program today? What are the 3 most invaluable things that you can do with your sustainable stove, or the 3 greatest benefits that you will get from the sustainable stove when you start to implement? Also, you can open it up a bit more. So that's very constrained. You're limiting them to 3 choices, no more and ideally no less. And you're trying to make them brief, right? 3 experiences, 3 favorite things, 3 most useful, most important facts I learned. But you could also provide them with an open-ended prompt. So you speaking with some kids in the field who just saw a hippopotamus in the field, and you say, how would you complete this sentence? Before I saw a hippopotamus, I never realized that what? How would you complete that statement? And then you would see what they learned, or what were the things that they were most stricken with the experience of seeing the hippo. It's a nice way to be able to, again, kind of focus their answers a bit so that it's focused just on hippos. You didn't ask them, before today, you never realized that what, right? You're limiting it and constraining it by saying, before you saw the hippo, you never realized that what? They might say how big they are, how threatening they are, how adorable they are, how much water they display, whatever it is. And from those, you can pull out information about how people perceive those animals. Right? Similarly, these last 2 possibilities, what do you think was the main point that the presenter made, is a nice way to be able to see if the audience really got the main thesis, the main purpose that the presenter gave the presentation, right? If the presenter is part of your organization, this is a great way to be able to assess how effective that presentation and possibly the presenter are in getting your point across. Okay. Last one, is there anything that would have made today's program even more enjoyable? What could we have done better, basically? This is, again, a focused and directed open-ended questions. So all of these 4 questions are not, tell me about what you're thinking about. They're not so broad that people could go in any kind of a direction, right? They try to focus people's responses so that you get the answers that you want to know, but still allowing them to populate what that answer really is, to say what that answer is from their experience. So open-ended questions like this that are more focused in terms of how people could respond are very useful. What is your experience with wildlife? Could be anything. It could range from ants coming into their house to human-wildlife conflict, to hunting, to poaching, to their pets. Maybe they view their pets as wildlife. Maybe their pets are wildlife, domesticated wildlife that they've brought in. So those kinds of questions are very broad, and they're so broad that in most cases they are not particularly useful. They might be useful if you're at the very end, the very beginning of the project, the front end kind of evaluation. Remember that from earlier on today. Before we begin an intervention, we're trying to find out what people think about wildlife. What are their major challenges? What are their opportunities? And so we might ask those kinds of really broad, open-ended questions. Tell me what you think about when you think about wildlife. It's very broad. It's a bit of a risk because you're providing them the opportunity to answer with anything they feel might be appropriate. So it is quite a challenge to be able to take those really broad, not focused, not constrained questions and to be able to get useful data out of that. It's not impossible. I'm not saying that at all, but it is much more challenged than if you were with like these four questions that we have on the screen today and all of the iterations that we came up with. If you have these more constrained foci or focused questions that will tell you more closely what you want to know. Make sense? So these kinds of focused, open-ended questions are often going to be your best friends because open-ended questions, as Alex talked a lot about in session 4, are really great ways to find out more about what the audience and the community is thinking about, much more than is possible with those quantitative questions. The multiple choices and check boxes and ratings and rankings and Likert scales and dichotomous questions, because open-ended questions provide new ideas that you may not have expected when you asked those quantitative questions, right? So these qualitative or open-ended questions are incredibly valuable. And when we include both things that we count, quantified questions, and qualified questions, qualitative and quantitative questions, this is called a mixed method approach. And this is what we're trying to do with our semi-structured surveys. So we want to create a few of these open-ended or qualitative questions. So before we get to the actual creation of those, let's talk about the relative ratio. And this is from my perspective. People have very different perspectives. Alex is very much focused on more of the qualitative questions. So she would have a lot of open-ended questions in her kinds of surveys. I am more of a quantitative scientist, and so I feel most comfortable with those, and I use a smaller number of qualitative questions. So because I'm talking about structuring these structured surveys, I get to set the standards. So from my perspective, and from the perspective of people like myself who do mostly quantitative research, it's best to have mostly quantitative data because for a lot of reasons. Not only is it stuff that we are most comfortable with, if you've worked with quantitative data, if you're a biologist, most of what you're working with is quantitative data, almost all of it. So you're going to be more comfortable with analyzing and collecting and conceptualizing this quantitative data more than qualitative data. In addition, not only are you going to be more comfortable with it, but it's easier to analyze, it's easier to code, and we'll get into what coding means, which is trying to take answers and putting them into numbers so that we can do a statistical analysis. So when we work with quantitative data, we can get a lot of data from a lot of people very quickly, and then we can analyze it very quickly. It's a great set of tools. So from my perspective, the way that I usually structure surveys is that I'll say have about 80% of the questions being quantitative questions on the dichotomous scale, the ratings, the Likert, the ranking, the multiple choice, the check boxes, those kinds of items. So, but I will always have qualitative open-ended questions because I need that open-ended data because that's really where you get the best stories. That's where you get the most interesting things in a survey. And my opinion, comes from the qualitative data. So usually I'll have about 80% of the questions on a survey being quantitative, 20% being qualitative. So the qualitative questions really are some of the most important questions. Well, all questions, all items on a survey are very important, but the qualitative items are disproportionately so from my perspective. So I think very hard about those in particular. I think very hard about the quantitative too, but very hard about the qualitative questions and formatting it and making certain that they're asking what I think that they are asking. And the way that I usually structure my surveys is that I'll do quantitative questions first, and then I will do qualitative questions, often as a follow-up to a series of quantitative questions. And I'll group them by topic. So if I'm interested in, say, a bushmeat consumption series, I might ask the questions about where are you from, where do you do your shopping, kind of the logistical questions first, and then I'll ask the questions that are a bit heavier, that are, as we'll get to in a moment, that are more focused on the bushmeat consumption. What animals, how frequent, why do you prefer them, or do you prefer them? If so, over domestic animals? If so, why? If not, why not? And then the demographic ones at the end. So those are sections rather. And the quantitative questions are great. The qualitative questions help to fill in the missing data, and it provides people the opportunity to answer your questions in ways with information that they weren't able to put into the quantitative data because it is so focused, right? And very often at the end of a survey, I will include one of these super broad, open-ended questions like, is there anything else that you would like to add about this topic? Just to see what people say. Often I won't use the responses from that more than just as illustrative quotes that help to illustrate the major theses, but it's a useful kind of approach, you know, this open-ended anything else at the end of the survey. All right, so let's make some qualitative questions. These were the 4 questions that we had up on the screen earlier. This was me interviewing a very famous sporting announcer, and let's make some qualitative open-ended questions. So take the 4 questions that we have on the screen as examples and come up with some of your own. Come up with at least 4 to 5 good qualitative open-ended questions. This may take you some time, so pause the video, maybe for longer than you have before, and think. What are some good qualitative open-ended items that help to answer your research question? Okay. Pause the video for a few moments, and then we'll get going again when you get done with your survey, with your open-ended items. Okay, how was that? Often the qualitative questions I find come really fast. The challenge for me for these open-ended questions are the editing of them, making certain that they say what I want them to say, right? So usually I'll write down a bunch of them very quickly, and then I'll come back to them and think, this one is almost there, but I need to specify where you bought the bushmeat. What did you think it was? Or I'll have to put some sort of a tweak on that open-ended question. So editing qualitative questions is incredibly important because you want to make certain that it is constrained. It constrains the answers that people would provide you, but it constrains the answers in a way that really tells you what you want to know. So, hope that was a good experience coming up with those qualitative open-ended questions. So, at this point, we've got almost all of our kinds of questions. The last one is a general category of questions. It's not really a type of question. And these are demographic questions. These are questions about who people are. Very often it is incredibly helpful to know the age, the gender that the people identify as, how old they are, where they come from, all of those kinds of things. Where they live now, do they live now in a different place from where they came from? Those are all demographic questions. So demographics are those kinds of factors, right? And typically, most people put the survey or put the demographic questions at the very end of the survey, because we talked about that social contract that surveys imply. And very often when you're first getting to know someone, you're becoming more comfortable with them the longer you talk with them. Demographic questions are very personal. If you were to ask a person how old they are and where they're from as the first questions, they might get offended. Like, I don't know you well enough to be able to want to tell you that information right off the bat. Let's hold off on that for a little while. So when many people, if you were to be approached by a surveyor and they say, excuse me, sir or ma'am, would you mind taking a few minutes to answer a couple questions that I have? And they start off with, first off, how old are you? Where do you live? How do you identify? You know, what is your gender? Like, people might stop answering at that point and say, no, I don't think I want to go any further. Thank you very much, and leave. Whereas with the social contract, after you've spent some time talking to them, finding out their perspectives on things, asking them interesting questions, asking them for their opinion on things because you value their opinion, you're creating that trust, that bond with another person. If you create that trust in a good way, demographic questions at the end of a survey are almost always unobjectionable. So you put the items that are asking about demographics at the end of the survey. Most people do this, not everyone, but most people do that. It's a good tool and it's a good kind of standard of practice. So think about that. So what I'd like you to do now is, for your research question, we want to try to reduce the number of questions across the board, right? But for right now, let's ask all of the demographic questions that might be useful for the research question that you have. How old are they? Where are they from? Where do they live now? What is their tribal affiliation? What is their ethnicity? What country do they come from, or were they born in? Where do they live now? All of those kinds of things. Their gender identity. All of those things are demographic questions. Write them down. Take a few minutes, pause it. You'll probably be able to come up with at least 10, 15 different demographic questions very quick. Okay, so unpausing the video now. What did you come up with? How did you format them? Right? Because this is not a question format, right? This is not an open-ended question. This can be a dichotomous. It could be a multiple choice. It could be a checkbox. We've talked about each of those in terms of demographic questions. So you'll have to think about how you want to format these items for demographic questions. So go through your demographic topics, demographic questions that you want to ask about, and for each item, think about how you would format it. Would it be a dichotomous? Would it be a multiple choice? Would it be a ratings? Would it be a rankings? Would it be well, it wouldn't be Likert. Would it be what? How would you do it? A checkbox, multiple choice, dichotomous? All of those things are typically the kinds of research questions. Age is often an open field, although you can usually also constrain that and give ranges. You can say 0 to 20, 20 to 30, or 21 to 30, 31 to 40, and so on. Okay? So you can ask for either the age, or you can break it into categories. And a tip about age, almost always it's best to break age into categories. particularly when men are asking women their age. Women do not like to be asked their age, as I have found, especially not from a man. So if you provide categories, people are much more willing to answer the age question. Women in particular are much more willing to answer the age question. All right, so just a word to the wise. Okay, so we now have hopefully a lot of questions. Hopefully you've been diligent about pausing the video and writing up a bunch of questions or a bunch of items rather for each of the type of question that we've been offering. Hopefully you have, oh gosh, like a dozen ratings and rankings and Likert questions or items rather, and now we have to winnow things. We have to cut things down. So let's think about the goal here. If you remember, how many items or questions did we say that we were going to have on this survey? About 10 quantitative and about 2 qualitative, and then the demographic questions after that. So let's think about the number of questions that you have written down, and some of them may be better as a dichotomous or a multiple choice or a ratings or whatever it is. So as we go through here, I'd like you to think about how you can take the hopefully many questions, many items that you've come up with now, and we want to start to cut some of them out or to select some for preferential inclusion because they are really useful. All right, so when we think about a survey, we have to think carefully about how we structure it. So question order is very important. And this is a survey design best practice, because if we ask a very heavy question right off the back, here's a question that I would not ask, but here's a question that many people could ask. I think it would set people's hackles up and upset them quite a bit and maybe stop them from answering. But if your first question is, are you or is anyone in your family a poacher? If you put that right up at the front, are they going to answer equally, openly, and honestly all of the other questions or items in your survey? I would say definitely no, right? So I usually personally put the easy questions at the front end, those that are easy to understand and answer. Ask them questions that are not very challenging. Tell me how you feel about wildlife on a scale of 1 to 5. Are you glad that there's wildlife nearby? How much would you agree or disagree with these statements? Make certain that they accurately reflect the study's purpose. You're not, as part of that social contract again, you want to be open and honest and direct with them, but you don't want to put in questions that would maybe be misleading or make them think that you're asking or promising something else, right? So make certain that the items in your survey accurately reflect the study's purpose. And from your perspective, you want that as well, because you only have a limited number of items that you're going to include in this survey. And so if you're putting in items that are not particularly relevant to the main research question, that's the wrong practice. That is not a survey design best practice. So try to accurately reflect the purpose of the study for your benefit as the researcher, to make certain that every question, every item is giving you something super important to answer your research question, and to be clear and open and honest with the participant. So when you ask and structure the items in your survey in this fashion, from easiest to understand and answer, those that are not challenging at the front, and then maybe the heavier ones, the ones that are closer to what you're really trying to find out, maybe 2/3 of the way through the survey, you're going to engage the respondents' attention and interest, and you are going to bring them into the survey so that they become more and more interested in giving you information because they're interested in talking about that topic. If your survey is an interesting one, people will want to answer it. And if you are kind and engaging, people will want to talk to you, generally. There'll always be people who say no. But generally, if you have an interesting survey that's well written and you're doing an interesting topic, and you would be because you're spending the time yourself to do this, people will be engaged and their attention will be given to you, and they'll be interested in knowing what you're asking and what the next question is and how they could answer it. All right. Last thing for this question order or this item order, put the demographic questions at the end of the survey, as we talked about earlier. People are more likely to answer you openly and honestly after they've created that kind of trust bond with you, and they know that you're not some crazy person who's trying to sell them something or trying to get their confidential information. You're just asking for general questions, general information, so that you can answer your research question. Make sense? Okay, so now here's the challenge. Go through your survey, and this is going to take some time. Allow yourself about 10, 15, 20 minutes, maybe a half an hour, and try to structure your survey along these lines. The easiest to understand and answer questions at the beginning, the not challenging ones at the beginning, and then put them in an order that makes sense from a person talking to another person, where you're trying to build that trust, build that social bond, build that social contract that we have with the participants in our surveys. Put the heavier questions, the ones that may be more socially challenging, towards the end of the survey, and then put the demographic questions that you want to do at the end of the survey. All right, so two steps. One, go through and circle the main questions, the main items that you want to include in your survey. 10 quantitative ones, 10 of the checkbox, multiple choice Likert ratings, rankings, dichotomous, and 2 open-ended questions. And then however many of the demographic questions you want to add at the end. So you may have maybe 15, 16 questions in total. But 10 quantitative, 2 qualitative, and then say 3 to 5 of the demographic questions. Think about how those demographic questions should be formatted, whether dichotomous, multiple choice, checkbox, ratings, or whatever. Check. All right, so pause the video now, sharpen your pencils, and get to work. Rank them first, choose the questions that you want to include, and then put them in the right order. Those are your 2 assignments. Go. Okay, so now we're back. I hope that was successful. If you have that, you now have a survey. If you were able to do all of that, you now have a survey with, say, 15 to 16, 14 to 16 questions in it. And this is fantastic. So congratulations if you were able to get to that point. If not, keep on. You'll be able to do it. As you can see, you just break down the effort into different questions, different types of items that you would use. Quantitative, qualitative, and then within quantitative, all of the checkboxes, multiple choice, Likerts, ratings, rankings, and multiple, and I think that was all of them in there. And then within qualitative questions, think about how you can focus the question so that it constrains their response a little bit to give you the answers that you want to know. All right, so congratulations. Now, let's go through a couple best practices for putting together surveys. And this may influence how you have structured your survey already, which is fine. You know, nobody gets it right the first time. Every idea can be improved. Remember, that's part of our basic assumptions for the class. Every idea is valid and every idea can be improved. So first, make it easy for people to respond. When you went through and chose your questions, those that you think were the ones that you absolutely had to include, those are need-to-know questions, right? If there's going to be a lot of questions that you would like to ask, but would really lengthen the the number of items that you have on your survey, and thus the time that it would take a participant to complete that survey, those would be nice to know questions. Ideally, in surveys that you create, you have only the need to know. I absolutely need to know this. If you do that, you'll help to constrain the length of the survey and make it much easier to collect more data from more people. So again, we're doing a mixed methods question here, or mixed methods survey here. So we have both quantitative and we have qualitative or open-ended questions worked in here. How did you put together your qualitative to your quantitative? Were there qualitative questions, the open-ended ones, that you put on as a follow-up to a quantitative question? If so, that's a very good structure to follow. Often, I like to use qualitative questions as a follow-up for my quantitative questions because it will provide some life for the answers from people. It's a good structure for it. Okay, so generally we're trying to make it easy for people to respond, and one of the best ways we can do that is to keep the questionnaire or the survey short. As short as we can to make certain that we're getting all of the information that we need to know. Okay, now when we're talking to people, and we'll expand on this in future sessions as well, when we're talking to people, we have to think of our audience, because we don't want to be very funny and jokey about a very serious topic. Nor do we want to be very serious, deathly scowling, stern-faced when we're asking about a kind of a funny thing. How are your kids doing in school? Are they having a nice time? Are they enjoying the time with your teachers? Right? That would not be that would be one that's a bit more appropriate to be a bit lighter. Whereas asking questions about poaching or bushmeat consumption, if these are questions that could be socially challenging, we want to be serious appropriately for the topic. Similar, when you think about your audience, think about their levels of education, what their attitude towards your topic is, what your main research question is, and what kinds of behavior would be most appropriate for talking to them. The knowledge and levels of education is important because you want to make certain that you're not writing your surveys to use language that is more challenging than people are comfortable with understanding, right? You don't want to speak to people who haven't gone to school past like 6th grade with the same vocabulary that you would speak to a person who has a PhD. Right? Phrase your question appropriately. Make certain that the things that you're asking of your participants are things that they could know, that they could have experienced, that they can understand. All right? Similarly, attitude is very important because if you're going into a very a community that is more hostile to conservation, you want to be able to make certain that you phrase your questions correctly so that they are responsive to your items. If you presuppose, if you assume that they are going to be advocates for conservation and you ask questions and your items are phrased in such a way that it presupposes that they are fans of conservation when they are not, you are going to have a great failure with your data. So we need to think about and anticipate what is the appropriate knowledge, attitude, and behavior of our communities that we're going into. All right. And then write the question in the verbiage, the script that we use when we're implementing the survey appropriately. Okay. Similarly, cultural sensitivity, of course, cannot be made more important than it needs to be, because it is incredibly important to be sensitive to the people of the culture that you're going to. Whether you live in that area yourself or are from that community even, because you are going into the community and asking them a survey, asking them to answer a survey, you're separating yourself from your community. If you are coming from outside of the community, which is usually the case, there's going to be some some cultural barriers that you need to be mindful of. And so we need to be very sensitive about the culture in the area that you're going to, and to make certain that we dress appropriately, as we'll talk about in a moment, but that we act appropriately, that we have the right people, that we are interacting with our communities in ways that are culturally sensitive and culturally respectful. It should be basic assumptions and basic knowledge, but it isn't for everyone. So let's try to be sensitive to our communities when we go in to speak to them. All right, so along those lines, let's take a few minutes, and relative to your research question, what are some of the issues about your audience that you would want to take into consideration? What, from the perspective of the humorous, serious side, what knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors your community has as its social norms, and what are the cultural sensitivity sticking points that you need to be mindful of? Right? So take a moment and write down the challenges and opportunities that your audience provides for you that you need to be aware of. All right? Take a few minutes and record those ideas. Okay, so now that we're going again, how many did you come up with? Did you have many? Very often there are, when we're not in the community, we come up with, say, 5 or 6 or 7 different things that we need to be aware of. Go to your community if you've not spent a lot of time there, and get a cold drink and go sit out on the street and watch people, talk to people before you start doing any of your data collection. It will provide you dozens more things that you are aware of, you become aware of, that you need to think about when you are creating your survey protocol, which is the goal of our next session, session 6. So think about that. Think of your audience and what you need to be able to do to make certain that you understand your audience well. All right. So if you have a lot of education programs that you're focused on, and your organization is doing lots of surveys of children, children are a very different approach than adults. What we've been talking about thus far has been exclusively with the focus of adults. Children have a different set of challenges. And I typically, unless it's an education program, I focus just on adults, because that's where the interventions are usually focused in conservation projects. That's the collaborators that we're working most closely with. But if you have an education program and you want to be able to assess the success of that education program, we need to be able to think about how to ask those questions in a way that makes sense for that age. I'm trying to move the question over because lighting continues to be an issue. Excuse me a second. Okay, so we can ask questions of children, and there are lots of valuable ways to get this. If you have an educator on your staff, a teacher on your staff, they are the people that really should help you with these surveys, putting them together, especially thinking about how they can be best implemented, the protocol for that, which we'll talk more about, and we'll touch back on this again in the next session. So we need to think about the age of the participants, the children that we're asking, and what their language skills are. If they are sort of pre-verbal or pre-writing, they've not yet learned how to read, these kinds of smiley faces are an easy way to ask children things. Often children get numbers understanding very quickly too, so you could also have ratings scale. The card sorts are a very good use. Make certain that are a very good approach, a very good technique. Make certain that your questions are very brief, very long-winded, multiple line kind of questions. You'll lose them very quickly. Make them very simple words, very simple sentences, just a few words in each sentence. Rating scales, as I said, are often very helpful. Open-ended questions can be a great tool, but these you really have to try to focus the effort, focus the responses that they're going to provide you. because children, for anyone who's ever done any youth education, will know that children can go off in completely random directions. So open-ended questions I find for children to be challenging. And so I often don't use open-ended or qualitative questions in children's surveys because of that. But if you're particularly skilled with qualitative questions and you have a good educator who's particularly skilled with it, go to it, because those are very useful sets of information, as we've talked a lot about, both Alex and myself. If you're doing an education program or an engagement program where you're having kids go out and, say, do some planting of trees in an area to further a reforestation effort, asking them the same questions before and the same questions after a regular pre-post survey is a great way to go. And those questions should be mostly quantitative, always structured questions, not open-ended questions very much. So we're using the traditional form of pre-post surveys, as opposed to the retrospective pre-post, where we ask relative to before the training, how do you feel? Children are usually pretty good with pre-post things, so especially for knowledge gains. Also, art works really well with children's. So drawings before, drawings afterward. How do you feel about, or draw what you know about elephants on a piece of paper before you do a presentation about elephants. You do the presentation about elephants, and then afterwards you ask them the same thing. Draw what you know about elephants. And don't give them the original photo or the original piece of paper. They'll draw something that's very different from the before because they have new information, new knowledge that they have gained. So art works really well with kids. Okay. Next up, we have to think about whether when we're talking to children or talking to adults, especially with adults, we have to think about how personal is the question. Because very often we can alienate people by asking these questions in ways that are too personal. So I'm going to put 3 different forms of a very similar question up. The top one, are working conditions satisfactory in the plant where you work? Open-ended, or not open-ended, very broad, not focused on what they think, not focused on their job, not focused on necessarily their specific perspective, because person could take that to mean, what does everyone think about the working conditions in the plant where you work, in the factory where you work? Second one, do you feel the working conditions are satisfactory in the plant where you work? More personal, because you're asking them specifically, do you feel that working conditions are satisfactory in the plant where you work? Not objectively, are working conditions satisfactory in the plant where you work? Bottom one, are you personally satisfied with working conditions in the plant where you work? So here you're really making it clear that you're asking them for their perspective. So with these 3 forms of really the same question, you're getting increasingly personal. And if people working in the factory are feeling like they could be fired at any moment, their job is not very secure, they don't feel very safe there, but they don't want to say that because they're afraid that if it's found out that they answered this question in a way that said that it's not very safe, they might not answer it truthfully. So here, in that kind of a situation where maybe people are not secure in their job and they fear that they might get fired, this first one, are working conditions satisfactory in the plant or factory where you work, may be the best way to ask this question. This bottom one, the most personal one, are you personally satisfied with the working conditions in the plant where you work, may be what you really want to know. But if it's possible that people could feel that they might be fired if they answer this question from themselves and negatively, you should probably go with the top one. Are working conditions satisfactory in the factory where you work? Right. We may want to know the bottom one. Are you personally satisfied? But if we ask that and people feel, I don't feel safe in answering that question, so I'm not going to tell the truth, it's going to compromise the quality of your data and could possibly expose them to negative repercussions. And we don't want to do that, right? Possibly getting them fired, getting them in trouble. So we don't want to do that. We would love to be able to get the data, but we don't want to put people in trouble. So think about how you ask the question and what could possibly be the repercussions if someone were to overhear them answering that question in that way. All right. Next up, simplifying the language. We talked about this with children, but it's equally as important for adults. When you're giving instructions, we want it to be very clear, very simple, and very direct. Would you have a moment to be able to answer 15 questions about people's perception of nature? It will take about 4 minutes or 5 minutes to complete, and all of your information will be kept confidential, and I will not record your name or any personally identifying information. Very clear, very simple. So if you ask those questions and then explain what a ranking is and how they would rate things and what a Likert scale question is, and you explain it clearly, that leads to the greatest success. Simplify your language, try to not use too much jargon, or any ideally, and be clear and direct. So to this end, we want to avoid a bunch of problematic wordings of items, and we're going to go through each of these in turn. I'm asking 2 questions in one. This is called a double-barreled question, and we'll go through an example and try to solve it in a moment. Asking leading questions. I'm from a conservation organization, and we really would like to be able to win this award that says that we have interacted well with our community. May I ask you the question of, what do you think of how we interact with our community? It's a little bit of a leading question, right? So we want people to be able to answer the question objectively without bias. And by adding all that precursor information about us wanting to win this award, that introduces bias into the question. Double negatives. I never don't fire my gun. What does that mean? So you're adding 2 negatives, a no and a never. And we try to avoid that. So ask questions only in the negative or only in the positive. I never fire my gun. State your agreement with that. I fire my gun weekly. State your agreement with that. Right? It's a much clearer way to put it. Similarly, as we said earlier, try to avoid jargon, because that does compromise the clarity of the questions and the instructions. All right, so, and of course, vague language equally is bad. One way to get around this is to, after you write the survey out, as hopefully you have already started, and will before we're done today, have others review it. Have others in your organization review it. Have someone who's not affiliated, your husband or your wife or whomever, a friend who's not involved in your program, ask them to read it and ask them if they understand things, if there are problems there. Okay, so let's go through a few of these types of questions to avoid. Double-barreled questions. Double-barreled questions are when we are asking 2 things at once. And these lead to confusions and confounded answers, which means that it's not clear which of the 2 questions they're actually answering. So the best way to go about it is to only ask one idea per question, or one topic per question or per item. So here's an example. This is a double-barreled question. Exercising and eating healthy are important to me. If someone says yes, are they saying yes to exercise, that they both exercise and eat healthy are important to me? Or are they saying, what if they only exercised but ate candy bars all day? How would they answer this question? They're diligent about exercising, but they eat candy bars and pastries all day. How would they answer this? So it's better to take these two items, these two questions, the exercising and eating healthy, both of them being important to the respondent, and break them into two separate ones. So how would we go about doing that? Take a moment, break this question into a way that would avoid this double-barreled question, but find out both bits of information. Pause the video. Okay, now, what did you do? Did you take that question and break it into two questions? As exercising is important to me and eating healthy is important to me. If you did the right thing, because then we've taken a double-barreled question, which is what's written up here in red, and converted it into two separate questions, each of which are a single item in each question. So exercising is important to me. Eating healthy is important to me. It's a separate item, separate question. That's how you can stop double-barreled questions. You get cleaner data. Okay, next up, leading questions. As I had said earlier with that earlier example, it produces biased results. So here's a great one along the same lines as that last one. Most doctors believe that exercise is good for you. Do you agree? It's a bit of a leading question, right? Because you're saying that these authorities, doctors, believe that exercise is good for you. And you're asking this person, do you agree with most doctors who are the experts on health that they say that exercise is good for you? Do you agree? So by doing that, you're of course biasing them to answer yes. So how could you change this? Second, next one. This is a little more questionable and challenging thing to recognize as being not appropriate, and certainly as being an avoid or a leading question rather. Please help us win a National Education Award by responding to the following question. How would you rate your program experience today? So that itself is a leading question. Please help us win a National Education Award by responding to the following question, right? Because if you like that organization, you're going to want them to win a National Education Award. How could they have made that not a leading question? Well, very easy, right? They could have just said, how would you rate your program experience today? That's how you can take out the leading question right there. Very simple. Then there's another aspect to this question, or this item, that is also leading, which are the options. It goes from good to very good to great to excellent. That is a leading set of answers that people could respond or select between. There's no bad or even okay or very bad or poor, right? It's all good. It's good to excellent. So if you were to write this question this way, with this item this way, how would you rate your program experience today and provide only these four options? You could say 100% of our respondents said that their program experience today was good or better. Well, yeah, because there was no other option to say that it wasn't good or less than good. Make sense? So the fixing leading questions can be pretty simple as well. The challenge is detecting that a question is in fact a leading question. That's the benefit of asking your friend. All right, so we've already done the running man thing. We could rewrite that first question as, do you agree that exercise is good for you? You could rewrite the second one by taking off the please help us win the National Education Award part of it and just ask, how would you rate your program experience today? And then you would have to change the response options to poor, not good, neutral, good, very good, and then stop it at that. So you'd maybe give them 5 options that way, and you would have the ability to get at least neutral as well as poor. So that's an easy way to fix those two. So leading questions can be both phrased in the question as well as in the options for the response to the question. We need to be mindful about that. All right. So negatively worded questions are challenging, and they're often difficult to interpret, and they can be confusing for respondents. So here's one. I typically do not eat vegetables every day. That is not clear what that means. I typically do not eat vegetables every day. So that could mean that you eat vegetables every other day, or it could mean that you never eat vegetables, right? It's both imprecise and a negatively worded question. A better way to say it is, in a given week, I typically eat vegetables 0 days, 1 to 2 days, 3 to 4 days, 5 to 6 days, or 7 days. So here we're providing them a multiple choice. They can only choose one of these 5 options. Right? That's easy to figure out. Similarly, and again, you'll notice that this had the negative in it, that I typically do not eat vegetables. And the reworking of it does not say negative. It says in a given week, I typically eat vegetables. And people could say, I never eat vegetables. Right? So similarly, avoid double negatives. Guns should never not be controlled, which means that guns should always be controlled, I think. Or just guns should be controlled. Right? These double negatives where it's never not, or I rarely never, right? These kinds of double negatives can really confuse a respondent and will definitely confuse how you analyze that data. So try to figure that out and try to avoid that as much as possible, especially double negative questions, but just negatively worded questions can often be best avoided generally. All right, so there's the last one too. Do you always avoid buying bottled water? Do you always avoid buying bottled water? What if you buy bottled water once a month because it's the only water that's available where you are? Would you say no? Would you say yes? It's not an easy question to answer that way. So a better way to maybe say it is, how often do you buy bottled water? And you could say how many times a month, for example. All right. So try to avoid negatively worded questions as much as possible. It makes your surveys much cleaner. If you do use negatively worded questions, state it very, very clearly. And we'll get to some examples of that in just a moment. So the surveys are people reporting their perspective, their experiences, their knowledge, their attitudes to you. This is called self-report because they're telling you and reporting what they themselves think. Makes sense, right? Self-reporting has a series of limitations on it, some serious ones as well. As I said at the outset of our session today, there are benefits and drawbacks to every kind of data collection. Self-reporting data, people can sometimes report more information than they really know and more than they can know. So they might want to seem knowledgeable, or they might want to seem influential, and so they'll tell you more things than they really know. You don't really know what they don't know because you're trusting them to tell you the truth. So because of that, these kinds of self-report data are often sort of challenging and can lead to some incorrect conclusions because people might not tell you the truth of what they know or what they think. Also, they might think they know what they think, but they actually don't remember it correctly because our memories are flawed. And they might say, oh yes, I saw 4 people there and there was really 1 person there, or it was 4 people and they were at a different location, not where you asked them. So they might think that they know something, and you have to be able to with both of these first two, try to be able to answer or ask follow-up questions about the respondent that might help clarify whether they are reporting more than they know and whether they know more than they think they know. People are flawed with our memories, and you can ask that for clarification as well. You can say, okay, you saw 4 people there. What did it look like where they were? Just to verify that those 4 people were where you thought that, or where you're asking about. Right? And they say, oh, they're by the baobab tree, and you know there are no baobab trees around there. Their memory is probably flawed. Often there's what we have experimenter bias or interviewer bias, where people like you because you're interested in them and you're interested in knowing what they think, and you're placing a priority on their perspective. People like to be heard. And so because of that, they may want to tell the interviewer what the interviewer wants to hear. So if you're a person who identifies as a conservationist and say, excuse me, ma'am, I'm interested in knowing what you and the community think about conservation. Well, they're going to think that you want to hear them tell you that they are all favorable to conservation. They favor conservation. They want elephants nearby. They love all of the wildlife. It's helpful for all of us. When in fact, they may not really feel that way. But because people are very kind, they might bias their responses to tell you what you want to hear or what they think you want to hear. And again, you can find this out by follow-up questions. Okay, and similarly, remember that you just can't ask some questions, that they'd be inappropriate to ask of people. Are you a poacher is one that I come back to quite frequently. I would never ask that of a person. There are easier ways to find that out, and asking someone directly that question just makes them angry and because no one wants to be called a poacher generally, or other, say, stigmatized modes of life. And so they're going to not respond clearly and not respond to the rest of your questions correctly, and they may just cut off the interview. So we need to think very clearly about what kinds of questions you could really ask, and don't violate that social contract with your participants and your community. Okay, so as we were talking about throughout, we want to make certain that the items that you have are actually addressing the research question that you're trying to answer. So as you have your survey together, now that we've been working on it in a bunch of different ways, and hopefully you'll work on it and edit it a bit more after we're done with this session, think about how well the survey as a whole and every item in it addresses your research topic, your research question. If it doesn't directly address it, if it doesn't provide information that is vitally important to know, the need to know, think about taking that item out or putting another item in its place. All right. Remember, is it necessary? Is it a need to know, or is it just a nice to know? We want need to know questions. Ideally, only need to know questions. So, when you're talking to respondents, do the respondents have all the necessary information to be able to answer? Do they know, if you're interested in rainfall, do they have a rain gauge that they could tell you how many millimeters of precipitation has fallen in the last month? If they don't have that necessary information to answer, that would be a bad question to ask, right? You could ask for how frequently in the last month did it rain here, but you wouldn't want to ask how many millimeters, because very few people keep a rain gauge in their yard, by their crawl, by their house. So make certain that respondents can answer the question. If they cannot, you should change the question for the item. And for right now, let's revisit our surveys and think about, for our running man, of the questions that you've prioritized most recently, let's revisit them and think about which of those questions are need-to-know questions. So let's pause the video, and when you finish it, let's let's get going again. Okay, so did you cut out any? Did you find others that you want to add? Because make certain that all of the things that you want to know are in your survey as well. Because you might have put in the best questions that you've written and pulled out the need to know questions, put those ones in, but there may be additional information that you need to find out through an additional item. Do you need to write additional items? And if so, in what format? Which of the qualitative or which of the quantitative, and whether you want a qualitative open-ended question in there. So do you have all of the information that you need to know to answer your research question? Not only are your questions need to know questions, but do you have all of the need to know questions in there that you need to know? All right, so this may require some additional time with your surveys afterward as well to go through and try to figure out, do you have all those questions in, all the items in that you need to answer your main research question? Okay, so some neat tools to try to encourage accurate response is to do two main things. One is try to avoid a whole series of questions that ask very similar perspectives, one right after the other. Right? A whole series of items that are stacked one after the other. These are called response sets. Sometimes you need them because they are all Likert format questions or ranking format questions, and it's easy to just put them in a sequence. It is what they are. If you have to do it, you have to do it. It makes it easier to put them into sets like that because then you only need to explain the format and how to answer them one time, as opposed to having it broken apart and say, okay, now we have another Likert question. Now this is strongly disagree to strongly agree with neutral in the middle. How would you state your agreement with this? So try to avoid putting similar questions too near each other unless they need to be because of question flow. Similarly, if you do need to do a response set, you can actually reverse score some questions. And I'll show you what I mean by that here. This is a scale that people use a lot called the Diener's Satisfaction with Life scale, with these 5 questions. And they ask you to rate your agreement with each statement using the scale of 1 to 7, where 7 is strongly agree and 1 is does not agree. So you'll see here, all of them are positive. In most ways, my life is close to my ideal. The conditions of my life are excellent. I am satisfied with my life. So far, I've gotten the important things I want in life. If I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. So a person who's very satisfied with their life might not read that closely and just see that the first couple are yeah, I strongly agree with those. And they put 7 down and they just write 7 all the way down. That's a bit flawed because people aren't really reading the question because this is a response set. And if it's the same kinds of question and people are going to always say, yes, 10, yes, in this case, 7, 7, 7, absolutely. And they're not really thinking about it. To try to encourage them to think about it, you could reverse score some. So I'm going to take 2 of those questions and change them around, and you'll be able to see by the font being different. So I took the first question and the third question and reverse scored them. So the first question was, in most ways, my life is close to my ideal. And I reworded it so that it would be reverse scored to read, in most ways, my life is far from ideal, right? So you can see that that's a negatively worded question, but it doesn't say no. It doesn't say never. It's not actually negatively worded, but it's a way to get the negative to reverse score it so that if a person was very satisfied with their life for this first question, they would score that a 1. They would say, I strongly disagree with that. But if you didn't reverse score it, you would have put it down as a 7, and same with everything else. Right? And so now for the third one, you can see that it says in the original Diener's Satisfaction with Life scale, I am satisfied with my life. I changed that. I reverse scored it to read, I am dissatisfied with my life. So now with this response set from the Diener's satisfaction with life scale, you would have to read this closely. If you were very satisfied with your life, in the first item, you would probably put a 1. Because my life is pretty close to ideal, right? If I'm very satisfied with my life, for the second question, the conditions of my life are excellent, I would put a 7. And then again, with the third question, I am dissatisfied with my life. No, I'm very satisfied with my life. So I would put a 1 there. So I would score it 1, 7, 1. And then the last two are, I've gotten all the important things I want in life. And if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. So I'd score those 2 as 7 as well. Whereas notice, if we didn't reverse score those 2 items, people could just put 7s all the way down and not read them closely. If you reverse score some of your items in a response set like this, it forces people to read it closely. And that way, you'll get better data and more accurate data that really reflects their experience, right? So reverse scoring is a nice tool if you do need to put a bunch of these items together into a response set. So think about that. But be mindful when you're coding it, when you're scoring it afterwards, that you have a way to make these consistent. And we'll get to that when we talk about planning for your surveys tomorrow, next session. All right, a couple other things. I often like to force people who like to answer neutral to things into making a choice. People who answer neutral to things, there we go, are called fence sitters. So they'll say, neutral. They don't really want to read the question that closely. But instead of offering an odd number of items or options for that item, I would offer an even number, because you can't choose in between 2 and 3. Say instead of 5, if I get a lot of people who are always answering neutral and I want to change that, I might just offer 4 items, and then people have to make a choice: very bad, bad, good, very good. So there's no neutral, right? So people have to say whether it's good or bad. It's a way to force questions. So it's sort of a way to get people to commit to saying that something is good or bad, or they agree with it or they don't, but giving them a way to say how much they don't agree with it at the same time. Very bad, bad, good, very good. So these 2 are both the bad, and these 2 are both good. So you could ping those together into a single category of bad and good, but you can also get a feel for the very bad and the very good as well. So these forced choice questions is what we're calling this on the ratings and the Likert scales makes people who would otherwise answer just neutral, forces them to make a choice, whether bad or good. Very bad or just bad. Good or very good. So it's a nice way to make it happen. You could also just do it with a dichotomous option, yes or no, good or bad. One could say that that's a rating scale that's very simple with just 2 options. Okay. Last, with these, we can try to diffuse that kind of make the interviewer happy issue that we often get by having impossibly positive questions. And then, like for example, every interaction I have ever had with wildlife has been positive. Right? No one has positive interactions with wildlife all of the time. I've been stung by bees, I've been bitten, I've been gored, I've had a lot of fun things happen as a field biologist. But if you put in those kinds of impossibly positive items, you can then see that person is probably trying to tell you things that you want to hear. And you don't want that. You want their true feelings. So if you put in impossibly positive questions, maybe as a follow-up after you do your first pilot study, which we'll talk more about next session, you could then use that as a way to be able to tell which respondents are telling you the things that you want, that they think you want to hear. And then you discount those respondents. Maybe you take them out of the data that you actually analyze, or maybe you include them but reduce the weight of those data. There's lots of ways to deal with it. So instead of each question equaling like a weight of 1, you would make them each question equaling a weight of 0.5, half of that, as a way to downweight it. So it's a way to get around this socially desirable response tendency that people do to try to make interviewers happy. So putting in these impossibly positive questions. I've always had a good time in nature. I am very well off financially, right? Things that people, I don't need any money whatsoever. You know, I am never at a loss for water, whatever it is. Impossibly positive questions allow you to get some insight when you're getting some responses back from your pilot studies that seem like everyone's telling you what you want to hear. Also, this is a fun little tool. If you have the opportunity to use the internet when you're interviewing your students, there's this tool called the implicit assumptions test. And you can create a tool of yourself to use. This is sort of super advanced social science stuff, but I wanted to share it with you for any of you who may be so inclined. If you go to this URL, they have a few pre-existing classes or tests that you can take, and it's a nice way to be able to determine a person's implicit assumptions that they make of the world. It's a way of getting at their base beliefs, which is useful. So check it out, the implicit assumptions test. It's a neat way to be able to tell and reveal gender biases or ethnic biases or racial biases, a bunch of different things that could be really useful if that's a focus of your research project. All right, so there are some ways to get around some of those problems that we talked about at the beginning of people not remembering things, of wanting to tell you what you want to hear, all of that. These are a few of those tools. Remember, and there's a bunch of other options as well, that the length of the survey, as I think we talked about earlier on in the workshop, that the length of the survey should be appropriate for the length of the conditions that you are asking them. If you're on the street and a person comes by and asks you, and you want to stop them for a moment to ask them a survey, you keep that survey very short, because otherwise they're not going to stay there and talk to you, because they're taking time out of their errands, because they're walking around town doing their errands, to talk to you. But if you're going into their house, you could have a longer survey, because people have invited you into their house to answer your questions. So maybe you are a bit more involved with your survey. Maybe it's more like 20 or 30 questions. Or even more to the point, if you are providing them an incentive, maybe a cold drink or something as a note of thanks for their time, you could add even more questions. So the length of the survey should be appropriate for the conditions in which you're doing the survey. Secondly, the order of the items on the survey is very important, as we've talked about earlier. The number of items in a set is important as well. Remember the set, we talked about reverse scoring a few of them. There were 5 items in that Diener's Quality of Life Index. Try to reduce it to less than 6 or 7 at the most, ideally fewer, because people get fatigued and then they just start writing in the same number as they get further down in a set. Standardize the survey format so that you don't have different fonts and different sizes and colors of text and all sorts of differences in the survey. People are most comfortable with a very consistent survey. Once they get the feel for implementing that survey, they'll be able to go through it quicker and more comfortably. So try to standardize the format in terms of the font, in terms of the color, in terms of the font size, italics or bold-faced or plain font, what have you. So make it consistent as much as possible and try to make it clear that way as a consequence. Keep the formatting simple and make certain that you ask for those answers that maybe you don't want to hear. Make it possible for someone to tell you that they hate wildlife. So put in the strongly disagree with the Likert statement about I appreciate wildlife. Make certain that there's an option there for people who don't value wildlife at all. You may not want to hear them say that they don't value wildlife, but they need to be able to have the opportunity to tell you that. All right. Okay, so we've been working on the survey this whole session. And what I'd like you to do is spend some time again with your survey and put it together. Think about, are they need to know questions, not nice to know questions, and make certain that you have all of the questions in there that you need to be able to answer your research question. So make certain all of the items are present that you would need to answer your research question in all of its facets. Then put them in the proper order as we were talking about earlier. Make certain that the demographic questions are at the end. And as I was saying, try to have about 10 quantitative questions, 2 qualitative questions, and then the demographic questions at the end of the survey, however many those are. All right, so let's do that. Check it again. Make certain that you have all of the questions in there that you need and that you need all of the questions that are in there. Make sure they're all nice, need to know, not nice to know, and that you have all of the survey questions in there and that they're in the right order. Take a moment, read through your survey, spend some time with it, pause the video, and come on back when you're ready to get going. Pause the video. All right, so if you have been successful with this, you have your questions, you have all of your questions, you have them sequenced, you have your demographics that you need to ask, and only the ones that you need to ask at the end, and you now have a structured survey. How awesome is that? Congratulations. If you've done this, then you are so close to being able to begin the survey. The next session, we're going to go through and talk about how to implement these things we need to be mindful of. We talked about a few of them. We'll revisit some of those next week and expand on them. But before we get on to what that next week is, there's a series of websites that I'm going to go through now. If you could note these down, and these will also, of course, be in the lecture notes, because there are a lot of great survey design websites that are very useful. Hope you like my pun. You ought to check out these great survey design websites. Cheesy, but these are the ones. Maybe you could take a screenshot of this page, because this has all of the URLs on it that we need. And on each of the next slides, it has a screenshot of what the page looked like when I first put this together. There's the next one from the American Evaluation Association. This is from AEA 365. They have lots of great stuff on there. Better Evaluation is a useful place to try to better understand how to improve evaluation processes. The Extension Service at Penn State, these are the people that work with folks in the field. They have a bunch of good, like asking demographic questions, for example, is one of their useful tools. How to ask it in a way that's sensitive and appropriate culturally. Evaluate is a very good website with a lot of things from the National Science Foundation. This is from the North American Association for Environmental Education. This is an education program in North America that has a great workbook for evaluation programs for practitioners. So check this out as well. So that's that. So you have crafted a survey. You now have a bunch of other tools to use if you would like additional resources on how to craft a survey. Next session, I'll walk you through some ideas about survey protocols and how to go about actually implementing these surveys. some different formats, some venues for doing it, some of which we've talked about very briefly here. We're going to expand on all of those in this next session. Hope you had a nice time today, and I hope this is useful and helpful to you. And again, thank you for all you do, because communities matter for conservation. We want to appreciate you and thank you for all of the great stuff that you have been doing and working through this program with us. We are making stuff happen here, and we are honored to have you in the program, and thanks for all that you're doing. Make certain that you log in to the Facebook group and add your topic questions or your topic responses to our topic questions. So again, I'm Dr. James Danoff-Burg at the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens, and it's a pleasure spending time with you all. Take care of yourselves.